So now that we've discussed the Coase theorem, which represents a private sector solution to externalities, we're going to talk about potential government solutions to externalities. So let's start off with a negative externality. So go back to our example of pollution. And so again, we're going back to our original example here with production of electricity. Okay. So again, we draw our demand curve, and then our private, right, our supply curve that represents the social, or the private marginal cost. Right, so our private marginal cost. And the market, as we said, is going to produce quantity M, and we'll have a market price of PM. However, as we said, there is this externality on the production side. And so this supply curve represents the social marginal cost, or marginal social cost. So the outcome, efficient outcome, would be for each kilowatt hour to be priced at PE and for us to only produce QE kilowatt hours. And as we said, that we get this, right, this externality in terms of producing where marginal cost is greater than marginal benefit, right, over this quantities between QE and QM. So how could we address this issue through government in order to get to quantity QE? Well, here we can use what we call a Pigouvian tax, and this is named after Arthur Pigou, who came up with the idea. And so as I mentioned before in the previous video, if you look at this distance, right, this vertical distance between the two supply curves, what's making up that distance? Well, that's the value of the externality, right? So simple solution would be to apply a tax that is equal to the difference between PE and PM. Right? So the tax, in this case, is equal to PE, or sorry, not PM, but P, right? So down here. So this is our tax. Now, it's important to note that the tax has to be set in order to get the efficient quantity QE. The tax has to be set at the level, right, of the marginal cost of the pollution that's generated at this level of electricity generation. Okay? Now, the way that the book gives it this example, that looks kind of like it's a parallel shift up of the supply curve. So you might look at that and say, well, why does it matter if the external cost, right, is the same at all levels of electricity generation? Well, it may not be in reality. It may be that this supply curve, right, that the external cost is actually getting greater and greater and greater. In other words, it might look something more like this. Right. And so you have to be careful, because the way we've drawn this, right, this line here, I'll make it a squiggle so it's easier for you guys to see it. Right? I've drawn it so that at QE, the tax, the efficient tax, would still be PE minus P down here, right, this amount. But if you tried to determine the tax based on the value of the externality up here, you'd be setting far too large of a tax. And you'd end up shifting the supply curve up by even more, and you'd end up reducing output below QE. So that's very important to bear in mind. Now, what about a positive externality, right? So clearly, the government can tax the production of electricity in order to try to reduce the externality. Of course, we'll go back to, in a couple minutes after we do our example of the positive externality, there's a question of whether, in an example like this, whether we want to tax the electricity or if we should try to directly tax the pollution. Now, going back to our positive externality, we have a very similar analysis. The difference is that instead of taxing, what we're going to do is we're going to provide a subsidy. Okay, so again, here's the market equilibrium. But remember now, the issue is that there is a positive externality, and before we put it on the consumption side, so we'll do that again here. And so that means that our demand curve really should be up here, right? We should be producing at QE, and the market price for, if we go back to our college education, right? Maybe this is number of college degrees. Right? So college should actually be more expensive, and we should be getting even more college degrees being produced because we're not internalizing those external benefits. Well, in this case, how do we get there? Well, again, look at this vertical distance between this demand curve, D, which is the marginal private benefit, and D prime, which is the marginal social benefit, right? So it includes that externality. And if you take that vertical distance, that's the value of the externality at QE. So now what we would do is we'd put a subsidy in place equal to PE minus P. And in fact, that is what state governments do when they subsidize state universities like Cleveland State or Ohio State, Miami of Ohio. And in an indirect sense, the federal government helps to subsidize education through subsidized student loans, right, by charging a lower interest rate than privately provided student loans through banks would charge. And so we actually do see some degree of this. And so, of course, the question arises, well, what's the right level of subsidy? Well, in order to know that and to answer that question, right, we have to know what is the value of that externality. And so we do have a debate in our society today because states have been reducing the amount of the subsidy they're giving to state universities, and Ohio is no exception to this. So right now we have this debate on whether this is a good thing or a bad thing to do. And of course, in order to answer that question, again, we need to know what is the value of that externality. Same thing with trying to tax things like negative externalities like pollution. We have to know what the cost is of each unit of pollution. Now, there are other solutions aside from Pigouvian taxes for dealing with negative externalities. Traditionally, in the past, what we've had governments have done is they've actually had, say, quotas on how much pollution you can generate. And then we moved to a much more efficient system, which was a permits system rather than just a cap system. We had a cap and trade system so that producers who could reduce emissions at a lower cost could buy pollution permits from producers who found it more costly to reduce their emissions, instead of just the government allocating those pollution rights and leaving it at that. So these are all the different things we need to think about, the different types of solutions that are available to policymakers in order to deal with these kinds of externalities. Well, our next video, we're going to talk about the efficient level of provision for public goods.